There is a particular kind of woman I am speaking to now, and if these words are for you, you will feel it not as information, but as recognition. It will be like hearing your own life read aloud in another voice. Perhaps you have sensed it already, the strange repetition of disrespect, the cold dismissals, the subtle humiliations that seem to find you wherever you went. Different faces, different rooms, same ache. When this pattern begins to shimmer into awareness, it is rarely an accident. In Jungian language, we would call this a moment of synchronicity, an outer event that coincides meaningfully with an inner readiness, as if the unconscious itself has decided that you are finally prepared to see. Before this moment, life felt strangely predictable. You played your role, competent, kind, adaptable. You wore your persona well. Jung used that word persona to name the mask the ego fashions in order to survive in society, the version of you who smiles when she is hurt, who minimizes her needs, who nods along to avoid conflict. The world praised this mask. People called you easygoing, strong, so understanding. On the surface, everything appeared in order. You worked, you cared for others, you did what was expected. Yet in the quiet hours alone in your car, staring at the ceiling before sleep, you felt a hollow place growing wider, a sense that you were present, but not fully here, performing a life that did not quite belong to you. And then perhaps quietly, the mistreatment began to accumulate in your memory like sediment. A parent whose love was always conditional, whose words cut deeper than they ever understood. A partner who twisted your every vulnerability into a weapon. Friends who treated your openness as a resource to be mined rather than a soul to be met. Colleagues who stepped over your efforts and then smiled for the photograph. You asked yourself again and again the most painful questions. What is wrong with me? Why do they do this? Why does this keep happening? From the standpoint of analytical psychology, those questions sincere as they are point in the wrong direction. They assume that cruelty is a verdict on your worth. They imply that if only you were better, quieter, prettier, more agreeable, less intense, the pattern would stop. But the unconscious is not interested in your self-blame. It is interested in your awakening. Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." This is the pivot around which your entire story turns. The people who mistreated you did not reveal your lack of value. They revealed the unseen architecture of your psyche. They are not proof that you are unworthy. They are evidence that something in you is operating below the threshold of awareness, repeating itself with an almost ritualistic precision. Think of it this way: you live on two levels at once. There is your conscious mind, the part that makes plans, sets intentions, insists, I want healthy love, I want respect. And then beneath that, there is the unconscious, a vast, deep reservoir of everything you have repressed, disowned, or never knew how to name. This is what Jung called the shadow. The shadow is not merely a dark storehouse of sins. It is a living, dynamic field of all your unlived potentials, disallowed emotions, and forbidden truths. It includes your anger that you were never allowed to feel, your power that frightened those around you, your longing that was mocked or ignored. You did not choose to bury these parts. You did it to survive. But the shadow does not stay politely in the basement. It shapes your attractions, your tolerances, your silences. It is the invisible script that guides you toward certain people and away from others. It is the quiet reason you feel oddly drawn to someone whose presence tightens your chest, the reason you remain where you are not honored. The mistreatment you endured is not a commentary on your soul. It is a symptom of a deeper pattern, an unconscious choreography in which you have been dancing for years. There comes a moment, subtle, disorienting, when the old choreography falters. Something in you, long silent, begins to murmur. You start noticing inconsistencies in your own reactions. A sharp comment lands differently than before. A dismissal that once felt familiar suddenly stings with a new clarity. The unconscious pushes upward, cracking the surface of your persona like a seed breaking through asphalt. This is the beginning of the liminal phase, the threshold space, where the old identity loosens but the new one has not yet formed. In Jungian psychology, such a threshold is not merely psychological, it is symbolic, almost mythic. You are entering what initiatory traditions call the descent. It begins subtly, a withdrawal from outer noise, an inward turning. You may feel exhausted by social obligations that once felt manageable. You may sense a growing alienation from the people who were once central in your life. You may even mistake this stage for depression, but it is something more complex, more sacred. Jung observed that when the unconscious seeks integration, it often pulls the individual inward, away from the world that reinforces their old persona. The descent is not a collapse, it is a call. As you move inward, you will begin to notice patterns that once operated invisibly. You may see that the emotionally unavailable partner who kept you longing in silence resembles in a symbolic way the parent who taught you that love must be earned. You may recognize that the friend who exploits your generosity is the externalized version of the inner voice that insists your needs do not matter. This is shadow material, rising not to destroy you, but to ask for recognition. Unlike the persona, the shadow does not speak in polished sentences. It speaks in impulses, in fantasies, in disproportionate emotion, in dreams that leave you waking with a pounding heart. One evening, perhaps alone in your kitchen, you might feel anger, clean, sharp, unfamiliar, rising in your chest. It startles you because for so long your anger has been exiled. But anger is a messenger. Anger says, something sacred in me has been violated. Jung insisted that confronting the shadow means reclaiming the energies you have pushed away, your authority, your desire, your aggression, your ambition, your hunger for truth. These energies have always been yours. They were only sleeping. As the descent deepens, something else begins to stir, something older than your personal biography. This is the realm of the collective unconscious, the psychic inheritance shared by all of humanity. Jung described it as the place where archetypes reside, universal patterns that have shaped human behavior for millennia. You begin to sense that the mistreatment you experienced is not only personal, it belongs to a lineage. The patterns are ancient. The roles victim, persecutor, rescuer, scapegoat are not simply relational failures. They are archetypal dramas reenacted across generations. You may begin to remember stories from your mother, your grandmother, women in your bloodline who tolerated too much, who spoke too softly, who carried unexpressed rage in their chests like a secret inheritance. Their wounds live in you, not as memories, but as emotional reflexes, as bodily reactions you never consciously chose. Depth psychology calls this transgenerational patterning, the way unresolved trauma travels through the psyche like an underground river. In this descent, you are not merely confronting your own shadow, you are encountering the unlived lives of the women who came before you. And then somewhere deeper still, you meet the figure Jung named the father complex. Not the literal father, but the archetypal father, the internalized authority that tells you whether you are enough. This inner figure may appear as perfectionism, as self-doubt, as the constant search for validation from emotionally withholding men. Its voice is familiar, hypnotic, shaping the choices you make in love and work. To see this inner father clearly is to feel the tremor of liberation beneath your ribs. This underworld phase is not comfortable, but it is precise, it is intelligent, it is the psyche preparing for transformation. As you move deeper into this underworld, the air thickens with the presence of what you have long refused to feel. Jung taught that the unconscious is not a passive storehouse, but an active realm, alive, symbolic, mythic in its intelligence. Here, the boundaries between your personal wounds and the great archetypal forces blur. Your dreams grow vivid, your intuition sharpens. You feel as though someone has turned up the volume on the inner world. It is disorienting, but also strangely clarifying, as if you are finally hearing the truth of your own psyche without interference. In this depth, you begin to encounter the parts of yourself you once believed were dangerous. The woman who speaks plainly without cushioning her words. The woman who says no before she explains. The woman who hungers for rest, for recognition, for touch, for authority, for the right to take up space without apology. These figures appear like shadows at first, frightening in their intensity. But as you sit with them, you notice something unexpected. They do not want to harm you. They want to return to you. This is the essential paradox of shadow work. What you fear in yourself is often what you need most. Jung insisted that individuation, the process of becoming your true self, requires the integration of opposites: strength woven with tenderness, boundary woven with openness, instinct woven with awareness. When you denied your anger, you lost your protector. When you denied your ambition, you lost your destiny. When you denied your desire, you lost your eros, the very life force that animates your being. Eros in Jungian language is not merely sexual energy. It is the connective principle, the psychic libido that binds you to purpose, relationship, creativity, vitality. Many women conditioned through generations of silence exile their eros early. They become productive, but not alive, loved, but not seen, responsible, but not fulfilled. When eros rises in the underworld, it often feels like a quickening, a subtle heat in the body, a pressure in the chest, a sudden clarity in the eyes. You may feel drawn to new creative impulses or startled by a longing you cannot yet name. This is a sign that your deeper life is awakening. But as your inner fire strengthens, the ghosts of old patterns appear. The emotionally withholding partner might send a message late at night. The critical parent might suddenly praise you in the exact tone that once hooked your soul. The friend who vanished might check in just as you begin reclaiming your boundaries. Jung observed that when the psyche begins to transform, the old system attempts to pull you back. This is not coincidence, it is psychological gravity. The familiar pain calls out, laced with nostalgia. The psyche tests your readiness. Here in this liminal darkness, the feminine lineage grows louder. You may feel your mother's unspoken grief moving through you like a fog. You may sense your grandmother's silenced anger in your own throat. Jung described complexes as autonomous psychic structures, clusters of emotion, memory, and meaning that operate like small personalities within the psyche. The complex you inherited around worth, love, and abandonment did not originate with you. It is older than your body. It is a pattern passed down through stories, silences, and survival. As you witness these ancestral currents, something profound shifts. You realize the mistreatment you faced is not the mark of your inadequacy, it's the point where your lineage was wounded. You are not just healing your own life, you are interrupting a transgenerational story that has never found resolution. The inner child who longed for tenderness and got coldness instead begins to stir. She is fragile, but she is also wise, and she carries the map to your transformation, because she remembers what you were before you learned to disappear. It is here at this depth that you begin to separate longing from destiny. You see that your attraction to emotionally unavailable partners was never about chemistry. It was about repetition. You see that your tolerance for disrespect was not a flaw. It was a reenactment of the early wounds etched into your nervous system. You see that the cruel voices of others echoed the harsh voice inside your own psyche, the one shaped by the father complex telling you to try harder, be better, earn affection through excellence or sacrifice. But now the spell is breaking. The unconscious is no longer pulling you backward. It is pushing you forward toward a self who is more whole, more integrated, more dangerous to those who once fed on your self-doubt. You begin to feel the edges of sovereignty forming not as a performance, but as a state of being. The woman emerging from this underworld is not the woman who entered it. She is slower, clearer, more intentional. She is beginning to understand that her power does not lie in being good, but in being whole. As you ascend from the underworld, you do not rise in a straight line. Transformation is never linear. It spirals, loops, returns. Some days you feel incandescent, as if you have broken open a new chamber of your being. Other days, the old patterns tug at your ankles, whispering familiar seductions. Don't upset anyone. Don't ask for too much. Don't risk being seen. These regressions are not failures. They are the psyche's way of testing the strength of the new structure forming inside you. Jung wrote that the self, the central organizing principle of the psyche, pulls us toward wholeness the way an acorn is pulled toward becoming an oak. Even when the ego resists, even when fear trembles in your bones, the self continues to send impulses, symbols, dreams, synchronicities. You may notice subtle signs: a dream of a locked door beginning to open, an image of a wild river, an unexpected memory that surfaces while you're washing dishes. These are not accidents. They are communications from the deeper strata of your psyche, guiding you out of the labyrinth. As the ascent continues, you begin to sense a reorientation of your inner compass. The ego, the conscious I, that once constructed your persona, starts to loosen its rigid grip on control. You may feel a new intimacy with your instincts, an ability to sense when someone's energy constricts your body or when a situation dims your inner light. This sensitivity is not fragility. It is intelligence. It is the psyche's way of signaling alignment or misalignment with your emerging self. In Jungian terms, you are now entering the phase where the opposites begin to reconcile: the conscious and unconscious, the masculine and feminine, the shadow and persona. The father complex that once demanded perfection begins to soften. Its voice no longer commands your choices. You start to recognize when you are performing for external approval rather than moving from inner truth. This shift is seismic. It breaks the old cycle in which you mistook emotional hunger for love, criticism for guidance, scarcity for normalcy. And as your inner father, the internalized authority, reconfigures, something remarkable happens. The feminine principle within you begins to rise in its true form. Not the conditioned feminine of compliance, charm, or self-erasure, but the archetypal feminine, instinctive, intuitive, sovereign. Jung understood the feminine not simply as gendered identity, but as the container of depth, imagination, emotion, and eros. When this principle awakens, your relationship to yourself changes. You move more slowly. You listen more deeply. You no longer override your body's warnings. You no longer abandon yourself for belonging. This shift often brings an unexpected sense of psychological loneliness, not because you are unloved, but because you are now standing at a higher altitude of consciousness. Many people who once felt familiar now feel distant, as if you were seeing them through new eyes. You sense their projections, their insecurities, their unconscious demands. You can feel when someone wants your energy more than your presence. You can sense when you are being asked silently to shrink in order to keep the peace. And for the first time, you do not comply. This loneliness is not a void, it is a clearing. A sacred space the psyche creates to anchor the new structure of your being. You may feel compelled to withdraw from certain relationships, not out of resentment, but out of intuition. You may begin protecting your mornings, your inner work, your dreams. You may feel the pull toward creativity, study, ritual activities that nourish the deeper layers of the psyche. These impulses are not indulgences, they are signs that eros is returning. Eros, the life force, begins to move through you again, not in chaotic bursts, but in steady waves. You feel more alive in your body, your desires sharpen, your intuition becomes trustworthy. You begin drawing boundaries not from fear or anger, but from a quiet knowing that your soul is not a resource for others to extract. And as you hold these new edges, you observe a fascinating phenomenon. People who once mistreated you begin to fall away. They sense the change before you announce it. They feel the boundary in your tone, the clarity in your eyes. The energetic channels through which they once accessed your empathy, attention, or emotional labor have closed. This is the reconfiguration of libido, psychic energy within the psyche. It is not punishment. It is the natural consequence of becoming who you are. In this place, you begin to attract different individuals, not because the world has changed, but because the inner constellation of your psyche has shifted. The self draws toward you people who resonate with your emerging wholeness, while the shadow-driven dynamics that once ensnared you lose their gravitational pull. You find yourself less tolerant of ambiguity in relationships, less seduced by potential, less willing to negotiate your worth. This ascent is not grandiose. It is grounded, embodied quiet. You are becoming a woman who listens to the subtle movements of her psyche and trusts them. You are becoming someone who no longer betrays herself to maintain harmony in the outer world. And then, almost imperceptibly, a new kind of clarity arrives. It does not crash in like revelation. It gathers gently like dawn. You begin to feel a sturdiness in your spine, a groundedness in your chest, a subtle but unshakable sense that you are no longer who you once were. Something in you has reorganized. Something essential has returned. You can sense it in the way you breathe, in the way you pause before responding, in the way your body no longer folds inward when someone disapproves. This is the moment in individuation, the alignment of ego and self, when you realize you have stepped into your own center. Jung taught that the self is not merely the totality of the psyche. It is the archetype of wholeness, the blueprint of who you were meant to become. When the ego surrenders its need to control and begins to orbit the self rather than replace it, your life takes on a different texture. Choices feel cleaner. Saying no feels less dramatic. Saying yes feels more precise. Your inner world and outer world begin to reflect one another in ways that feel uncanny, as if the unconscious is now guiding your steps with a quiet, benevolent intelligence. In this state, the old wounds do not disappear, but they no longer dictate your fate. The father complex loses its authority. The ancestral patterns loosen. The shadow becomes an ally rather than an adversary. The inner child, once curled in fear, now stands beside you, integrated and seen. You feel a continuity within yourself that was once impossible, a sense that the many inner figures who once pulled you in conflicting directions are now working together towards something coherent. And in this coherence, sovereignty emerges. Not the brittle sovereignty of defiance or isolation, but a soft, luminous sovereignty, a state in which you belong deeply to yourself. You no longer seek permission to exist. You no longer contort yourself for acceptance. You no longer mistake intensity for chaos, longing for fate, abandonment for love. This sovereignty reveals itself in small, holy decisions, leaving a conversation. When your body contracts, declining an invitation that drains you, choosing companions who treat your inner world with reverence, pursuing work that aligns with your deeper intelligence. You begin to see that every choice is a vote for the woman you are becoming. You move through the world with a quiet authority that does not need to be announced. Yet, with sovereignty comes a different kind of responsibility, the responsibility of consciousness. Jung observed that when an individual becomes more conscious, they influence the collective unconscious around them. In your presence, other women sense the possibility of their own liberation. They notice how you hold your boundaries without aggression, how you speak truth without cruelty, how you inhabit your body without apology. Something in them stirs. They feel it. They may not have language for it, but their psyche recognizes a pattern breaking. You become, without trying, a disruptive archetype in the lives of those still caught in the old dance. Not a savior, not a guide, not a symbol of perfection, but a living contradiction to the narratives they were taught. Your wholeness becomes an invitation. Your clarity becomes a mirror. Your presence becomes a threshold through which others may choose to walk. And then, at the quiet center of this transformation, you realize something profound. The mistreatment that once shattered you served an initiatory function. It was not deserved and it was not just, but it was the catalyst that pushed you toward depths you would never have entered otherwise. Those who wounded you revealed the fractures in your lineage, the shadow within your psyche, the archetypes that governed your choices. They showed you where you were unconscious so that you could awaken. They were the unwitting midwives of your becoming. Now you stand in a new landscape, one shaped not by survival, but by self. You feel an inner stillness that is not emptiness, but fullness. You feel a vastness inside you, as if the walls that once confined your life have dissolved. You feel yourself belonging to your own soul again. And from that place, a final truth rises, simple and luminous. You were never defined by the wounds you received, but by the self that rose to meet them. If this journey speaks to something stirring in your own depths, I invite you to linger with these ideas, to explore further, to share your reflections, and to join this ongoing conversation on Jungian psychology, feminine consciousness, and the inner work of becoming whole. Like, share, subscribe, or comment if you feel called, not as a routine gesture, but as part of your own unfolding path toward awareness.